Conspiracy theories. The word conspiracy is often used as a derogatory term used to belittle someone's argument. That is to say, that your argument is equivalent to a conspiracy, something with no evidence to suggest or to back up such a wild claim. It's this type of mentality that has led to anything being labeled as a conspiracy being automatically rejected instead of actually being reviewed and discussed. Now, I'm not saying that there are lizard people running around the White House, the Earth is flat, or the moon landings were fake. However, when a theory that has substantial evidence behind it, the theory should be given some amount of credibility, despite what it may say about our society. After all, isn't that how science works? The theory of evolution is considered a fact because it has substantial evidence to back it up, despite what it may say about religion in the time of its discovery. Some conspiracies, especially ones with lots of evidence, did end up being real. For example, MKUltra was a big conspiracy theory until eventually CIA documents were released detailing the extent of the experiments. MKUltra was a CIA experiment to test mind control on willing and unwilling US citizens through the use of drugs and other methods. It was a way to combat the fears of the Soviet Union and their attempts at what the US believed was mind control. The extent of the program was unknown since many of the documents leading to MKUltra were either destroyed or documented poorly on purpose. Now, before its existence was known, it would have been crazy to think that the US would conduct such experiments on people. This idea, that the government would propose such an idea, would sound insane to anyone, hence why the label of conspiracy theory was placed on MKUltra until finally being declassified 2 decades later. The reason this sounds so absurd is because we are brought up to think and act a certain way in society, and when something opposes those societal values with evidence, it's labeled as a conspiracy. In a sense, it's a form of confirmation bias to the societal norms of our society. If something opposes it, we label it as a conspiracy. Crazy ideas in any field are subject to being laughed off as a joke at first. Charles Darwin would not publish his own works because he knew of the backlash he would receive from the scientific community as well as the religious community. Planck and Einstein, when proposing the theory that light acts as a particle when evidence had before backed up the claim that light was a wave, was met with heavy criticism at first as well. Gregor Mendel's radical approach led to the discovery of alleles with dominant and recessive traits was also laughed off in the beginning. These and many more scientific ideas were considered revolutionary at the time. They completely changed everything we thought about science, and because of that, they weren't taken seriously. But over time, people soon started to accept these facts with sufficient evidence. Which brings me to my point, that if a conspiracy does provide enough credible information, it should be considered a fact, or at least entertained without being ridiculed. Here, I will bring up the case for certain conspiracies to be discussed more openly from an example of another conspiracy that was proven true, the business plot. The business plot was a ploy to make America a fascist state and overthrow the Roosevelt administration for several reasons. During this period, the economy had crashed, leading to the Great Depression. To mitigate these issues, the Roosevelt administration had to use government powers to intervene and aid the people during the crisis. Many of the social programs and laws he had to do with curbing back the power that industries had over people. Laws were placed in order to protect workers' rights. Evidently, the people in power did not appreciate that fact. Thus, the business plot came into play. There was strong evidence to suggest that there was a plot to overtake the government, with the whistleblower being Smelty Butler, who was a decorated war hero at the time. No charges were placed on the ones who tried to seize power, probably because the richest and most powerful being in jail would not have helped the economy recover at the time. Many people in power were a part of this plan, but the most interesting one, and the one who was claimed by attorney Scott Horton, was Prescott Bush, a wealthy banker and politician, as well as the father of George H. Bush and grandfather of George W. Bush. Interesting names, right? Both of the Bushes have a fair bit of controversy surrounding them. George W. Bush started his tenure as president dealing with the terrorist attacks being 9/11. 9/11 itself has a huge conspiracy surrounding it, being that the building was set to crumble and that 9/11 was an inside job. Again, absurd, right? But let's look at some evidence. Did you know the US had actual plans for this exact scenario, except with the Cubans in the height of the Cold War? This plan, known as Operation Northwoods, was a plan to commit acts of terror on American cities and blame the attacks on Cubans to force America into a war with Cuba. Fortunately, the plot was dissolved by the Kennedy administration before it could happen. However, it is still alarming to consider that it could have been implemented under a different presidency. George W. Bush could have been the type of man to accept such an operation, resulting in a war that has claimed millions, and worse, seeded hatred for those of the Islamic faith. Many mainstream conspiracy sources like to say that there were bombs in the building, but that is simply false and has been disproven. If conspiracies are to be taken seriously, then we must consider the evidence provided, even if it doesn't fit with what we initially thought. That's how new ideas are found in any field. However, just because the bombs being in the building were false, doesn't mean that the theory is completely wrong. The American government had actually helped create what would later become 9/11. During the Afghan War in 1979, the Soviet Union had invaded Afghanistan to support the communist regime in the area. Many anti-communist rebellions were fought against the communist regime, which was not favored by the people. The CIA had been funding these organizations to ensure that the area would not fall to communism. The Mujahideen happened to be the group that would later become Al-Qaeda, and the Soviets were forced to leave that area. The government would later fall in 1992, leading to a power vacuum that would allow for bin Laden and Al-Qaeda to grow. There are allegations that the CIA purposely funded these operations that would eventually lead to 9/11, although many have debated this as false. Some agreements were that they were indirectly benefited through their training with Pakistan, who the CIA had funded military training for. Since Afghanistan and Pakistan had many joint military training sessions, they indirectly received training through the CIA. Also, many of the beneficiaries of the CIA funding were close associates of bin Laden, including, pardon my accent, Jalaluddin Haqqani and Gulbuddin Hekmatyar. The CIA also had many opportunities to stop bin Laden before 9/11, yet did not. According to History.com, the CIA had many opportunities to stop him, yet did not due to, quote, a lack of coordinated intelligence sharing, bureaucratic infighting, and a failure to grasp the scope of the threat at hand. However, these seem to merely be an excuse for allowing bin Laden to grow powerful enough to allow for 9/11. The CIA isn't incompetent. As one of the world's leading intelligence agencies in one of the most powerful countries, it seems a little weird that they would allow for something like this to fly under the radar. Instead, I believe the CIA intentionally let bin Laden grow more powerful until eventually he was able to strike down the Twin Towers, allowing for America to be justified in a war in the Middle East. Now, why exactly would the US want to go to war in the Middle East? Simple. Resources. The Middle East is filled with resources that the US would want, specifically oil. Oil was what transformed Saudi Arabia into what it is right now. By attacking the rebels under bin Laden as a pretense, America was able to turn a significant profit from the invasion, with oil companies seizing the opportunity to take oil from the country. Another reason could be the idea of a Pax Americana. This idea would suggest that the world would be under the protection of the United States, and as long as it stays that way, there will be relative peace. However, if a country were to go against the US, they would be met with the full force of America. That's exactly what Iraq did by switching its oil currency from the US dollar to the euro. Both the US and Britain had sanctions placed on Iraq in order to make sure the country did not make any WMDs. Iraq did not like this since they wanted a fair deal for the oil, as what they were getting back was less than what they were receiving, being food and resources that the country desperately needed. They saw two camps, being the US and Britain, who wanted to keep the sanctions on the country, while the other countries such as France, Russia, and China wanted to ease up on sanctions, provided that there were no WMDs found in the country. This would also impact the amount of oil that was under the US dollar significantly. All these things added up, it made tons of sense why the US would feel that attacking the area would be of benefit to them. Now, with all that being said, there is a fair amount of denial for these accusations, stating that it was simply willful ignorance, conspiracies. However, with the amount of evidence, such as a motive, past plans of such action, and odd coincidences, It almost feels like 9/11 was a false flag operation. But again, that is for you to decide. Conspiracies should not be dismissed as something completely absurd, lacking any evidence. Some conspiracies out there have a foundation in reality, some even turning out to be true. To dismiss something simply because it seems outlandish is simply wrong. If we hadn't listened to great scientists of the past who made radical discoveries that changed the way we viewed science, we wouldn't be where we are right now. As Albert Einstein would put it, the measure of intelligence is the ability to change. I hope you enjoyed. Thanks for watching.